I'd now like to welcome Yasmin Rehman as our next speaker. Yasmin will be a familiar face to many of you here. We were delighted to award her the Secularist of the Year Award in 2017 for her outstanding work in defending women's rights from religious fundamentalism. She is a fellow of the Muslim Institute and has worked for more than 30 years predominantly on violence against women, race, faith and gender, and human rights. Last year, Yasmin was elected as a member of the NSS Council, where her long experience and expertise in championing human rights in the face of religious privilege has proven invaluable. Please join me in welcoming Yasmin Rehman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And like Pragna said, it's just wonderful to be here and to be amongst allies and friends, because there are so few spaces now where we can talk about these issues in a safe way and in a way that doesn't result in threats and abuse. I thought long and hard about what I should say, because there is so much to say. And if any of us sat and looked at a map and looked at the countries around the world, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Myanmar, Pakistan, India, Nigeria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the list is endless. And these are examples of where religious communities suffer persecution, but also those of no faith are also suffering persecution. Whether it's in the form of intimidation, whether it's in the terms of discrimination in the workplace or in schooling, or whether it's murder and mass murder. But there are also, as Stephen Evans described, godless states such as China, and Ahmed Shahid alluded to that this morning in the case of the Uyghur Muslims. We are indeed living in dangerous times. But it's interesting that calls for religious freedom from religious groups is an interesting call, because they're only calling for rights and protections for themselves. I never hear faith leaders, unlike feminist activists, human rights defenders, and you've heard from some of them today, where when we stand up and call for human rights, we're talking about women, we're talking about indigenous and native populations, we're talking about LGBT communities, ethnic minorities, non-believers, migrants. We're talking about everybody's human rights. But those from faith backgrounds are only interested in themselves, and it's really, really disappointing and bloody annoying. Giles Fraser, who's a very angry man for a man of the cloth, he wrote an article in The Guardian following the attacks in Sri Lanka, in which he railed against the secular and broadly progressive West for turning a blind eye, as he said, to the fact that we are living through one of the most serious phases of Christian persecution in history. Well, I'm not a historian, so I can't really say if we really are living through that, but I do know from my A-level days, which were a long time ago, that Christians did indeed spend centuries persecuting each other. Yeah. But Muslim organisations too, we've heard a bit about the call for a definition of Islamophobia, which, and I sit on the cross-government working group on hate crime, I absolutely do not support, for reasons which I've made public and I won't go into today. And that's not to say that Muslims aren't subject to racism. Since my parents came to these shores in the 1950s, we've, as a community, as visible minorities, we've all been subjected to racism. But again, they're calling for special protections. And earlier this month, at a meeting at Lambeth Palace, a number of Christian bishops joined, and it's amazing how they always come together on these things, joined the Chief Rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, Imam Kari Asim, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, no less, and our very own UK Foreign Secretary, must be careful, Jeremy Hunt, in calling for greater protections for freedom of religion and belief. One bishop went as far as to call for freedom of religion and belief to inform all government policy. Now, as a long-standing human rights activist and feminist, I absolutely support any calls for an end to human rights abuses, whether against religious groups or indeed any other. However, what I will not endorse is a call protection of one group over and against another. Calls for protection of one group whilst ignoring and remaining silent and not standing against the persecution and abuse of others. I'd like to remind those faith leaders, or anyone indeed, or even those of no faith, who only want their own tribe protected, including the not-so-delightful Giles Fraser, of a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt in which she said, "Freedom makes a huge requirement of every human being. With freedom comes responsibility. For the person who is unwilling to grow up, the person who does not want to carry his own weight, this is a frightening prospect." Freedom does indeed come with responsibility. And this responsibility, in my view, extends to those of faith and those of none, to acknowledge that we have to speak out against every abuse, and not just those in which people from our own group or tribe are the victims. We must be prepared to speak out when human rights abuses are carried out in the name of faith and religious ideologies, or covered up by faith institutions. This is not an either-or choice. There can be no hierarchy of victimhood. As believers, we must be prepared to examine our own faith ideologies and ask those really difficult, troubling questions about what we do when religion endorses, justifies, and allows discrimination, prejudice, abuse, threats, violence against those who are outside of our group, or even sometimes those within. I challenge faith leaders particularly to say, where do the boundaries of freedom of religion and belief begin and end? Are you only prepared to extend human rights to those like you, or who believe what you do? Are you prepared to stand by and protect those who have a different worldview to you and those like you? Where are these religious leaders? And I call particular on those from my own faith background. I'm a Muslim. Where are you when gay men are thrown from buildings in the name of religion? When lesbian women are subjected to corrective rape? When women are denied access to basic medical services, let alone abortion and contraception? And when women and girls, when every aspect of their lives is controlled by religion and religious practice? When girls are denied access to education? But it goes even further, when young girls cannot even feel the wind blowing in their hair in the way that their brothers do. Where are these religious leaders when teachers in our schools are trying to teach our children how to respect diversity and difference? When they're trying to encourage an atmosphere in which our children can be protected from harm and abuse? They're teaching our children how to have a voice and to know where to go for help should they be at risk of or be victims of abuse. Well, if you're in many of our cities and towns right now, you'll be able to see for yourselves what's happening. The backlash against the teaching of RSC, Relationships and Sex Education, has left me absolutely stunned. I sat on the board of the End Violence Against Women Coalition for almost 5 years at a time when we were campaigning. As feminists, we were standing up and campaigning for relationships and sex education. And what I see playing out, and Birmingham's had a particular view, and I'm not based in Birmingham, this is happening in cities and towns across the UK. We're seeing a perfect coalition of fundamentalist movements who wouldn't normally even give each other the time of day, a time when Orthodox Jews, when fundamentalist Christians, and when Islamist movements have come together against what they see as a common thread, which is the education of our children to protect them from harm. It is being led from the front by Muslim parents who are, if not the most vocal, then at least the most visible. And when I talk about this perfect coalition, I'm talking from what I've been told. So if I hadn't been at this meeting, I would not have believed, had someone else relayed to me what was actually said. I'm now Nottingham based, and I went to one of the meetings that Dr. Kate Godfrey Fawcett spoke at. It was hosted by a man called Imam Hassan Hamid, who is a prison imam, and God, don't we know the trouble that imams have caused in prisons, but hey-ho. Where they openly said, we are being funded by the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child, that this is Jews, Christian and Muslim parents coming together because we're terrified about what RSE will do to our children. I sat in a room of hundreds of Muslim parents and grandparents. I was one of 3 women who weren't hijabbed. And what I heard was truly, truly terrifying. RSE is converting our children to be lesbian or gay, or bisexual, or even transsexuals. Our daughters will become, one of the quotes from the odious Kate Godfrey Fawcett, and I'm sure I can say that here, is that our 12-year-old daughters will become promiscuous, they will be sexually exploited, they will be having endless terminations, and you as parents will never know, and this is all an international conspiracy led by the UN on one hand and the International Planned Parenthood Foundation on the other, to render the Muslim community sterile so that we can no longer produce. And I sat there open mouth thinking, what the beep? She made connections to the Palestinian question and said, this is more urgent than any concerns you may have about Palestine or Kashmir. This is more urgent than any discussion about the hijab. This is about our children. This is about the continuation of the Ummah. The Ummah doesn't really matter when Sunnis are killing Shias and MDs are dying, but anyway, she was really concerned about the Ummah on this particular day. And she ranted on, and this was a 5-hour meeting in which luckily there was a break. And there were a number of parents who came up to me and were saying, oh my God, what can we do, what can we do? The second half of the meeting was saved for the strategy. When the second half of the meeting started, Imam Hassan Hamid then stood up and said, our sisters, look at you wonderful women. You carry the burden of Muslim identity. And look at these three non-hijab women who do not stand. What can we expect from these 3 women? At that point, I knew maybe I should start thinking about leaving. And then the whole discussion kind of then followed about the strategy and the template letters, which you will have read about, and organising activity, peaceful action, very, very clear about peaceful action outside of schools, and that there was this whole kind of movement that was going to go all across the country. The Imam then again pointed at me and said, sister, what will you do? So I thought, I've got to say something now. And I said, well, one of the things that's worrying me is that you're talking about RSE in schools, but our children have access to mobile phones. I couldn't think. I was like desperately on my feet, thinking on my feet. And he said, well, mobile phones, yes, I've been thinking about. I don't think anyone should have a mobile phone until they're married. And I was like, yeah, I'll take that one back home. I'll take that one back home, I said. So anyway, at that point, I decided I couldn't take any more, and I left. And I went to my car, and I sat in my car, and I burst into tears. And I'm going to get really upset now. I was messaging Stephen constantly from the meeting, poor man, because I think he probably thought I was on speed or something when he was reading. And then one of the brothers came out and said, sister, I don't know why you're upset, but I hope that you wear the hijab, and I hope that you learn something from this, and you go. And I said, I've learned an awful lot. Thank you, brother, I'm going. And when I got home, I sat there thinking, how did we come to this? And I ask myself this question after every terrorist incident that is perpetrated by a Muslim. And I was really thinking about it in this context, and I keep coming back to the same thing. Faith schools, which the NSS campaigns on, how divisive are they? What is it that our children are being taught about in those faith schools? And how does that even sit with community cohesion? But thinking about the separation, because one of the things that was said was if the government doesn't listen to us, at this meeting, Kate Godfrey-Fawcett said, the government doesn't listen to us, we are going to withdraw Muslim children from schools. She didn't just want them not taught about RSE, she didn't want them to know about music, she didn't want them to know about dance, she didn't want them to know about the art, she didn't want them to know about so much of the rich curriculum that I strongly believe children should have access to. She also completely denied the rich heritage that Muslims have in terms of the arts and language. And then I thought about madrasas and how they have shifted those, and how education has become. Organisations like Ofsted are too afraid, and if they do stand up, they don't really say anything, and they leave teachers unsupported and isolated, as can be seen over hijab debacle, which I just think was appallingly handled. Madrasas have gone from, when I learned to read the Quran, from you would troop along on a Saturday morning and you would learn to read Arabic, to every evening, 3 hours after school. And during the school holidays, that the imposition of a particular dress code, as if to be a Muslim is confined to one way of dressing and one way of being. It ignores the rich cultural, linguistic traditions and heritage of Muslim communities across the world. And what is it the children are being taught in those madrasas? And I was reminded of an incident that involved my children. I'd had my hair cut, and the imam had, that you now have parents' evenings at madrasas where my kids used to go. And the imam had said, we can't speak to you because your mother's cut her hair. Until her hair grows, it's a sin. And I pulled my kids out of the madrasa at that point, thinking, this is bollocks. There's no way I'm sending them there. But what are we doing as communities to our children? It's by engaging with each other and conversing with each other that we will break down barriers. It's about recognizing the humanity in each other that we will break down those barriers. Not teaching our children that they belong to a group that is chosen, that is special, that on the one hand is the most victimized, but on the other is the most valued and prized by Allah himself. That separation of our children, and it flies in the face of religious freedom, because the imposition in madrasas and in religious schools of one way of being, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu, because we're seeing that it's spread across all other religious groups. Where does it sit with what Ahmed Shahid talked about in terms of freedom of religion and belief? Where does it sit in terms of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the right to play and the right to have a childhood, the right to be free of a mortgage and Brexit discussions? Where does all of that sit? We haven't got here by accident. We've got here because successive governments, as Pragna has said, have failed each and every one of us, whether you have a faith or you do not. They have failed to show us due consideration. They have failed in their duty of care to society as a whole. And they have carried on their imperialist policies of dividing and ruling, and they have nurtured the racists, and they have nurtured the fundamentalists. And we have to stand up. And I absolutely endorse and echo and stand side by side with Pragna when she said, there is no choice. The price is far too high. We have to stand up and fight. Thank you.